Hello everyone and welcome to this week's Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group, with Philip Nothard and Curtis Hutchinson, bringing you all the chatter that matters.
Well, you know what, Phil? It's just as well it's a bank holiday weekend because we've actually got a lot of stories to get through. So there's potentially a lot of listening here, isn't there?
There's a lot being crammed into a 4-day working week, aren't there? And I suspect it'll be the same next week as well.
Next week.
But, happy Easter, everybody. So Easter weekend is here. So we'll try and keep this weekend's podcast fairly tight, but we have got some big stories to come this morning. So, but we must start off with last week's used car special podcast. That if you haven't listened to it, then I would really urge you to check your podcast feed and have a listen. That's where we had Phil Jones, who joined us from eBay Motors Group, and he was talking around obviously what the trends are within the retail used vehicle market. And that was on the back of an interview with Darren Martin earlier in the week that ran through the trade performance in the marketplace. And as always, the conversation turned to EVs, didn't it, Curtis, as it does?
It certainly did, yes. As conversations in this podcast will turn to EVs at various
Very difficult not to get away with any podcast without some kind of discussion or reference to battery electric vehicles at the minute, isn't it, with everything going on. But yeah, if you haven't listened to it, a great interview. It was very well picked up as well, with some great shares and comments and in the social feeds. So I mean, we'll have to get Phil back on again each quarter, because I think it was great to have him on covering through some of the trends and data that he'd been seeing through eBay Motors Group.
Yeah, definitely. And just to join you in wishing everyone a happy Easter. And Phil and I are both aware that not everyone's having this long weekend off, because a lot of you will actually be working, and hopefully the showrooms are nice and busy.
Yes, yeah, that's it. You see, I'm not in that world anymore. I get the weekends off now.
Yeah,
but,
me too.
For some time. But anyway, we're trying to keep you happy on an Easter Saturday morning. So we've got a busy session this morning, but we will get on.
Motor Trade Radio podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group.
Headlines this week are from AM, Car Dealer, and Motor Trade News. Large fleet orders drove March's 18% jump in new car registrations, while the new van sector enjoyed its third consecutive month of growth. Lookers goes for growth on the back of strong full-year results. eBay Motor Group's research shows how dealers can boost their test drive bookings. Car Dealer reveals the ebbs and flows of each car manufacturer's UK networks. And finally this week, Peter Vardy reopens a former Cazoo handover centre as a used car supermarket.
So as Curtis has said there, that we head over first to AM Online, and this is on the week where we've had the figures for March, which obviously then also give us the indication of the performance for the first quarter of the year, and they've been published this week. But as you know, they heading over to AM Online there, and we're talking about figures here of as Curtis has said, that we are seeing an increase. So large fleets drove March's 18.2 new car registration growth, and I think the clues in the title there, didn't it, Curtis, that the reference to fleet. Because significantly we have seen an increase in fleet registrations in the month of March this year.
Yeah, and ostensibly the figures look really positive. So a total of 287,825 units were registered. And if you look at the split between private and fleet, private registrations were up by 1.4%. Whereas those to large fleets, so fleets over 25 vehicles, are actually up 41% to 40,651 units. It was also the eighth consecutive month of growth for the new car market. And this is a figure we're going to talk about, I know, Phil, because the SMMT said it was the strongest Q1 since 2019. So that's the strongest since the sort of pre-COVID years, with 494,000 units registered and representing a year-on-year growth for the quarter of 18.4%. So what did you make of these figures? Because I know you've got a view and data.
No, yeah, I think
Q1.
you're right. I mean, obviously, I was eager to see what was happening in the month of March, and we've been talking throughout the month that there is appetite now returning to channels that had been previously closed off, whether that's lease, rental, tactical registration markets, because there was a heavy demand in retail, and retail is a lot more profitable for the manufacturers. But clearly, the results signify that there is a return to that fleet and leasing sector. There is appetite now towards the rental market, which means on the back of production, which increased 5 million last year compared to 2021. So the annual global production for 2022 was up to 85 million, which was ahead of many forecast expectations. But yeah, to your point, Curtis, I mean, it's great because 18.4% up quarter on quarter compared to last year is a great result. Each month, whether it's Jan, Feb, and March, are all ahead of the 2022 and 2021 figures, albeit 2021 was 283,000 for the month of March compared to 287,000 this March, Curtis. So we saw a bit of a jump in March of 2021. But we've got to remember that 2019 first quarter figures were just over 700,000. And the average between the year 2000 and 2019 for the first quarter of the year is 676,000 compared to the 494,000 we did this quarter. So it's heading in the right direction, but it's nowhere near pre-pandemic levels as yet. So, positive signs, production's up, activity's up, manufacturers are now back into sales channels that they previously closed off. But it's this question of what that means for the remainder of the year. But yeah, it's putting those figures in context for you there, Curtis, that you were caught out by the 2019 reference in the SMMT update.
Yeah, and that was very much down to the way the press release was presented, because it was the SMMT that pointed out that it was the strongest first quarter since 2019, but didn't actually go into the detail that you just did as to how big 2019 was. So yeah, it is all relative, and some much needed context around there. That some interesting figures that I spotted. It was the best month for zero emission vehicles. If you look at battery electric vehicles, hybrids, and plug-in hybrids in the round. So collectively, they were up 34% and accounted for 35% of all registrations. And that actually compares to just 5% 5 years ago. So it's gone from 5% to 35%. So moving in the right direction. But it's worth noting that although volumes were up year on year for both EVs and plug-in hybrids, their combined market share was pretty much unchanged year on year at 22.4%. So registrations are growing, but the market share isn't growing maybe as fast as it needs to, and which maybe the industry thought it would.
Yeah, I mean, that's the distortion, because you've obviously got growth in terms of volume, which obviously defines the share as well. So in a market where, bearing in mind 2020, 21, even into 2022, where we had a significantly constrained supply market and the petrol diesel product was also constrained, that was giving a not necessarily false, but a slightly distorted market share towards battery electric vehicles because of the significant drop in overall volume and the drop in combustion engine as well. So, as the volume starting to come back through, it gives a more stable and more realistic market share growth. But I mean, you've got some interesting results by manufacturer, because this is key, isn't it? I mean, we usually talk about the winners and losers in terms of volumes by manufacturer, but you clearly that it's been a fairly good month for most of the manufacturers year on year.
Yeah, now it's not that far back that if you looked at the manufacturer listings that the SMMT produces every month to go with the registration figures, that pretty much everyone was in a negative, and that went on for a long time throughout the lockdowns and throughout the COVID period. But looking at the figures for March, most of them are plus, which is really encouraging. So I don't want to be too negative, but let's just look at some of the brands who are showing a negative. So Abarth down 70%, BMW down 3%, Fiat down 17%, Jaguar down 16%, Lexus down 27%, Peugeot were down 11%, Renault down, Smart was down, Tesla, interestingly, was down by 19%, and Volvo down 10%. And one I was particularly interested in looking at for March was Vauxhall, because a couple of months ago, we actually covered on the podcast that they were introducing this 0% APR across all their car range. I think they introduced it in February, so it was up and running in time for March, but they were actually down for the month at 6%. So bit of a surprise, and I'm sure a bit of an internal disappointment there for Vauxhall, and unless some of those orders carry through into April. And one other brand that I was interested in seeing how they did over the course of March, and indeed the first quarter, was Mercedes-Benz, because of course they went into agency at the beginning of the month, so they're selling solely through agency now. So registrations for the month were up at 9%, but in the year to date, they're actually down 5%. So I think Mercedes-Benz are going to be an interesting one to just track over the coming months and quarters.
Yeah, and I'm sure that other OEMs are probably that are considering the transition to agency are probably watching it as well, Curtis, I suspect. But
yes.
Let's see how that's going on. And some of it will be, their move to electrification through the EQ product, and the view and the strategy on a return to profitability rather than volume as well. So there'll be a numerous variances to that and to why it's happening. But just in before we move on to the commercial vehicle performance for the month of March, so to share with you some of the activity in some of our other markets as well across Europe. So you've got France finished on just over 182,000 vehicles, up 24.2% year on year. Italy, 168,000, up 40.8% year on year. Germany actually behind us in terms of volume at just over 281,000 vehicles, up 16.6% year on year. And Spain up to 99,500, but that was a 66.1% increase year on year for Spain there. So again, demonstrating some of the variances around the pandemic, the challenges across Europe, manufacturer supplies into different countries, and as we start to come out with that and supply comes back in, how it starts to sort of throw some of these percentages. And even the US, I mean, the US have got some challenges over there at the minute, but they still finished on 1.4 million, up 8.7% for the month of March. So some big numbers in terms of March performance in many of the markets.
Yeah, and I suspect there's plenty of context around Spain up 66%.
There will be. It's how low they went as well,
yes. Yeah. And it's nice to see us ahead of the German market, because that doesn't happen very often, does it?
No, you're right. And I mean, to your point on Spain there, just before we move on, I mean, they were down to below 60,000 last March, but that was a 30% drop on the March before as well. So they've had some ups and downs in Spain as of late. So yeah, I won't fancy reporting forecasting on the Spanish market at the minute with that kind of volatility. But yeah, it's a great performance.
Next headline is from Car Dealer, and it is SMMT hails strong start to 2023 for new van sector as market grows for third consecutive month. So that pretty much tells the story, doesn't it? So,
Move on.
yeah, next story. So LCV market grew for the third month in a row. So registrations are up 17.3% to 47,634 units sold over the course of the month. But March 2022, we talk about year-on-year comparisons, and March 2022 was a deflated month with just 40,500 units registered. So it's an improvement, but it's an improvement from, still quite a low base. So demand last month was up across all segments, except for vans weighing up to 2 tons, which we've noticed actually over the last few months when we've been reporting on the LCV sector. It's those small vans that seem to be underrepresented in the registrations, and those sub 2 ton vans fell by nearly a quarter at 25%. So again, an interesting one to watch, I think.
No, definitely, and positively in terms of the battery electric vehicle sector, for vans, which I know is a very difficult market. And if Paul Kirby is listening to us this morning, a 4.7% increase in market share, up from 1,900 in 2022 in March up to 2,500, which takes the year to date to just short of 4,500 battery electric vehicles registered in the commercial vehicle sector, which is positive in terms of growth, a 4.6% increase, but obviously not to the level that we're seeing in cars there. So, activity in the commercial vehicle market is still positive. I think it's still very strong in the used vehicle market as well, but showing signs of slight variances there. So like you say, Curtis, challenges in that sub 2 ton market, and obviously battery electric still a challenge in terms of acceleration, but lots of work taking place in that marketplace.
Yeah, and worth pointing out that Q1 is actually 17.4% ahead of last year, with just over 87,000 units registered.
So lots of things going on, but if we head over to AM Online now and look as COO, in their recent financial announcements was quoted that we're ready to acquire and grow the Lookers car hub business. So, it's great, isn't it? We're starting to talk a lot more about Lookers in terms of their positive recovery, their financial performance, and now we're talking about acquisition and growth for Lookers after that, that challenging time they went through a few years back. But no, it's great from these guys at the minute. There's a lot going on in the Curtis.
Yeah, definitely. And you're correct. They did hit a few bumps in the road, but that they seem to be on a much more solid foundation now, and a lot more sort of optimistic. They're talking about growth. They've announced the launch of this standalone car hub, which we'll talk about in a moment. But all this news is on the back of their 2022 full-year results, which showed a 6.2% rise in turnover to £4.3 billion, while underlying profit before tax was down 8.2% to £82.7 million, although that actually represented a 3% growth when the government COVID payments of just under £10,000 million were stripped out. So a good set of results there for Lookers, and interesting to see that so in terms of sales revenue, driven largely by very strong margins, with a GPU on new vehicles up over 30% at £1,949, and remaining stable on used vehicles at just over £2,100.
Yeah, and they do cite, and we talk about growth, but we can't, if we look back at 2022 in terms of the financials, they make a reference to the after sales business in particular in terms of highlights there, that it's mobile cosmetic repair business. And also in 2022, they obviously new partners with such as BYD, Great Wall Motors with the Aura there, Lotus as well, growth in MG and growth with Xbus. So kind of throughout 2022, they've done significant growth within their own existing businesses, but actually now they're on the acquisition trail, aren't they, for further growth?
Yeah, and they make that quite clear in the coverage from AM that they are looking at growth, and one of the areas will be through acquisition. So we'll see, I'm sure, over the coming months what is on the table there. But this particular story really focuses in on the opening of a new standalone car hub in Middlesbrough. So it's at what is currently a Ford site. So I guess it's being redeveloped at the moment in time for opening during Q4. And it's a supermarket. It'll have a strong EV presence, but it's very much sort of multi-brand, multi-franchise, and it's a sizable site as well. Now, what will be interesting is how scalable it'll be. So it'll be branded under Looker's Car Hub branding, and they will be testing it in Middlesbrough, and I'm sure they'll be looking at rolling it out elsewhere in the country.
Yeah, and as you say there, it's all about service repair, cosmetic repair, talking about obviously investment into the 650 kilowatt EV rapid chargers on site and an EV experience centre, which is obviously similar to what Vardy's have got two of up in Glasgow and Staffordshire. So that whole EV growth, that whole experience, knowledge, expertise, and they talk there about where people can come and learn about zero emission vehicles. So again, I very much doubt this will be the first and only. I think this will be one of many that I suspect they will start to invest and open across their network. But it's great to see them on the growth trail again after a time of sort of stabilisation.
Yeah, and there's a lovely quote from Duncan McPhee, Chief Operating Officer, who says, the used car sector is huge with over 7 million transactions a year, and we currently have just a 1% share of that market. This new venture represents a great vehicle for us to improve on that and grow another part of the business. So we can expect to hear a lot more about Car Hub.
You're listening to all the chatter that matters on Motor Trade Radio, powered by eBay Motors Group. This is your weekly one-stop shop for all the biggest car retailing headlines from across the media, available on demand wherever you are on your podcast feed. Next up is our latest Menable moment, looking at mental health and well-being awareness, issues and best practices across the automotive sector, with me, Stephen Whitton. Hello everyone, it's Menable Moments time again, and a very happy Easter to you. So hope you're well, and whatever you're going to be doing this weekend, I hope you get the chance to take some time out, recharge those batteries and let the stress subside a little bit and enjoy the long weekend. Of course, if you're in a business, chances are this weekend's probably pretty much like any other. So my thoughts are with you on all of that. But I hope you do get a chance to get those batteries recharged. And that's what I wanted to talk about this time, really, is that it is Stress Awareness Month as well in April. And Easter, for me, has always been probably my favourite time of the year. And it's not for religious reasons. It's purely because, one, it's a long weekend, and two, it generally comes with either some really nice weather. Not always, of course, because we're in the UK, but quite often some nice weather, or at the very least, the indication that nice weather is on its way. The daffodils are up, the birds are singing, the days are longer, and all of those indications that spring is here. Now, that, and of course, the symbolism of Easter is all about new beginnings, fresh starts, rising again, all of that kind of stuff. And I totally get that, and I love it. And I think that's why I love the Easter period so much. But this week, and it is Stress Awareness Month, as I've said, this week I've had 2 calls from senior execs who are stressed off the clock. They're really feeling it. And they were saying that apart from it maybe being a bit of an age thing, they are really starting to notice that they're working long hours, and come the weekend, they just flop and spend most of the weekend sleeping. And then when they do go out with friends, quite often that evening is cut short because they can hardly keep their eyes open. And unfortunately, wine and beer don't help. But anyway, that is a kind of an indication of where you can be when you've got a lot on your plate and stress levels are high. Don't forget the rev counter, of course. That's a good way of thinking about where am I revving, where are my stress levels. And I resonate with all of that because that's where I was. That's where I used to be. And it would mean that a weekend was typically a bit of a write-off because you spent most of it flaked on the settee or asleep or whatever. So just wanted to give you all a bit of a shout out, really, and just to say, look, whatever you're doing this Easter, take some time for yourself, have a bit of a think, allow those stress levels to ease, and think about, what are you doing sort of typically day to day, and is it stressing you so much that come the weekend you literally are no use to anyone? Because maybe now is the time to have a bit of a rethink and revisit all of that and, refresh, recharge and revise how you're doing stuff. Easier said than done, I know, because if you're in a busy business, it's quite often sort of business as usual. But we've done the New Year's resolution bit. That came and went. And we've had, fortunately, not the toughest of winters, but it's still been cold and drab. And here we are now, longer days, bright nights, nice weather hopefully on the way. So use that as an opportunity to recharge those batteries, stop and think, and take a little bit of a view of what you're going to do going into Q2, Q3. That will enable you to be a little less stressed and a lot more effective and a lot more efficient. So what are you going to start doing? What are you going to stop doing? And as you go through all of that, what are the opportunities for you to just stop and reflect and refresh and rise again? So have a fantastic Easter, and we will catch up again in a couple of weeks. Take care. See you soon. Bye.
Well, many thanks to Stephen there, as ever, for some timely comments on health and well-being, especially over the course of the long weekends.
Talk about rise again, Curtis.
Yeah, rise again. Yeah.
No, I think you made the point, and that we must remember we are a retail independent supermarket dealer podcast in the main, who many do listen on a Saturday morning whilst they're either at work or on the way to work, or they're listening after work. So we are in an industry that the bank holiday weekend, particularly the Easter bank holiday weekend, albeit Sunday, many do now close because they have to over a certain square footage, will be working and will be trying to maximise the opportunities over this bank holiday weekend. So it is key that there is some downtime and some looking after yourself within that as well. So wise words as always from Steve there.
Yeah, definitely. And if you'd like to get in touch with Steve, you can find him online at menable.org. You can email him at stephen.whitton@menable.org, and that's Stephen with a PH. Or you can find him on LinkedIn. He's been pretty prolific over the last week or so. He's been out and about, and he's been taking photographs. So
He's been out and about with his ice cream at coast somewhere. I can't remember where he went, but he was taking pictures of him enjoying ice cream in the sun, getting some downtime, some restful time, I think.
Yep, and why not?
Why not? So heading on with the headlines then. So heading over to Motor Trade News, and this is boost test drive bookings by offering longer sessions. Now, this is some findings from the latest eBay Motors Consumer Insight Panel, who poll the views of 2,000 in-car buyers, and they asked what would encourage them to test drive a car they were interested in, even if they were undecided about whether it was worth their time taking it for a spin or not. So, again, some interesting findings on this one, and it needs some context behind it, doesn't it, Curtis?
Yeah, it does indeed. And I did work with the guys at eBay Motors Group on this story. So I did see the data, and it really is fascinating. So topping the list of incentives were these unaccompanied test drives, and they were actually favoured by a third of all buyers. Although it's interesting to point out that 23%, so just under a quarter, actually appreciated having a salesperson present in the car on the test drive to answer questions. So, it's not cut and dried. Some buyers prefer being unaccompanied. Others prefer having a salesperson in the car. So, it's interesting contrast there. And as you mentioned, longer test drives, they were very popular with 4 in 10 buyers. And these were actually evenly split between those who want a car for 24 hours, so overnight, that was 25%, and those who wanted the car for a full day, which was 24%.
Yeah, and I think that with those listening, they'll probably know because they're in the sector. But the 24-hour compared to the day test drive is normally referenced that that's the day one is taking the car in the morning, using it throughout the day, and dropping it off at the end of day unaccompanied. And then the other one is obviously where you get the use of the vehicle to go home in and have it overnight. So it's kind of an extended test drive, so you can take it back home to the family or experience it on your driveway, etc., rather than just taking it for a drive through the day. So yeah, I think it's interesting because, like you say, there isn't one single answer to this. There's no solution.
No,
It's a
no.
variance of there is demand for both, and it's interesting to your point that accompanied and unaccompanied test drives is always a question, isn't it? Because do they
It
want
is,
that
yeah.
salesperson with them? It depends on the customer.
Yeah, yeah. And I was looking for a new car and bought one 3 or 4 years ago, and I went on a number of test drives, and they weren't brilliant. It was 20, 30 minutes around local roads, which didn't tell me a huge amount about the cars that I didn't know already.
Yeah.
And in retrospect, I would have been much better off having the car for a day or overnight and really getting to experience it more. And of course, with the COVID lockdowns, it made unaccompanied drives sort of more acceptable and more of the norm than they were before. So maybe we'll start to see those coming back in. But there were other key influences that came out in the survey with sales staff revealing in advance any special offers that are available on the car, and that option was identified by 31% of the buyers. So that's quite an interesting one because it's not something I think sales staff are going to be that keen on doing, giving away too much in advance. But if it's a way to get a customer into the car to experience it, it may well convert that sale. So that's something that's it's a judgment call on the day, isn't it?
It is, and I always like these kind of surveys with the because we always assume as a sector that we know what the customer wants, but actually this is reality. This is in-car drivers telling the dealers, the retailers, what they want as a consumer. It's not all, to your point, it's not all cut and dry. We assume that people want certain things, but actually this is really good intel that actually says, you know what, there are certain things the dealers should be looking at and investing in, and actually other things that maybe the customer's not that interested in doing or looking at. So it's great insight.
Yeah, and I guess also it's food for thought over this long weekend because we had Phil Jones on the podcast last weekend saying that Easter typically sees an influx of footfall into dealerships. So it'll be a busy time for showrooms, and it'll be a busy time, hopefully, for test drives. So maybe time to reflect on what customers actually need, and indeed ask them the sort of test drives that they're actually after.
Definitely. So heading on to the next story now, and this is a story in Car Dealer, and this is dealers still critical to car buying as list of how many dealerships each brand has in 2023 is revealed. Now, this doesn't share the source of the data here, but they do talk about the brands, the OEMs that have increased their dealer outlets and those that have decrease their dealer outlets. Now, we obviously talk about this quite a lot on the podcast. We spoke more recently about the JLR strategy in terms of their dealer representation reduction. We've talked a lot about over the years around Ford and Stellantis and things like that. But actually, this actually shows some of those that have increased with open points or new entrants into the market.
Yeah, I think the big surprise of this story is that year on year, the number of franchise dealerships has actually gone up. It's gone up by 13 showrooms to 4,577 showrooms. So it's good to see the size of the universe, because throughout my time at Motor Trader, I was asked a lot, about how big is the franchise dealer sector? How big is the independent dealer sector? And there were never any really sort of reliable go-to sources for that information. I mean, we had a pretty good idea based on our readership and the number of sites we went to. So it's good to have a figure there. And I was intrigued by some of the visuals as well, because it actually shows within the story the manufacturers who have lost the most sites and those that have gained the most sites. So if we look at some of the reductions first, so Ford were down 20 sites year on year, Nissan down 7, Honda also down 7, Mercedes-Benz down 6, and Jeep down 4. So and then if scrolling down, it shows which manufacturers added the most dealers to their networks. And no big surprise there that the manufacturer that added the most was Ineos, because it was a new brand launched last year and has added 24 sites to its network from a standing start. Also, MG, they came second with 12 new sites, but the curious one for us, because we talked about this before, is in third place, it's Land Rover, who added 11 sites to its network over the course of the year. And of course, this is on the back of dual arch. So we're kind of wondering where those 11 came from.
Yeah, and I mean, remember this is data up to the end of January over the last 12 months. Now, obviously, potentially through the pandemic period, there may have been very little movement in terms of openers and closures of sites, but it's still going on now. But as you say, I mean, it's interesting there, because clearly the JLR announcement, not just in the UK but globally, is about that reduction in dealership representation for the Land Rover operations, and sorry, more for Jaguar operations, weren't it, rather than Land
Yes.
Rover? So
Yeah.
maybe this is it is more of a shift from Jaguar into Land Rover, because it doesn't show Jaguar on here. I don't
Jaguar
think
aren't
Jaguar
mentioned,
are not
no.
on mentioned at all, either on the increase or decrease. So it's interesting to get this data. They say there's no source to the data. There's a few commentators in the report there. So you've got David Kendrick. Congratulations, David, by the way, on your new role as CEO of Hacker Young. That says that the data is very interesting. That it certainly highlights the fact that certain OEMs are looking to consolidate and reduce their numbers of representation points. And then you've also got our friend of the podcast, Steve Young, there, who could see the network shrinking further in the next few years. And he makes a point in there that networks remain far denser than is required. In work that they've done with Urban Science last year, they demonstrated that if you cut a typical 120 point sales network to just 60, average drive times rose from 17 minutes to 24 minutes, and 94% of the UK population would still be within 40 minutes of a dealership. So some interesting points come out at the back end of this data that's been revealed.
Yeah, I mean, that's quite a frightening statistic from Steve there, isn't it? And probably one that we wouldn't want to dwell on for too long, especially for listeners tuning into this.
From
But
120 to 60, yes. Yeah.
yeah. And only adds 7 minutes onto a sort of average drive time to your nearest dealer. So yeah,
Definitely.
fascinating.
So as always, before we get into the final story of today, do head over to these stories, particularly this one, and look at it in a little bit more detail. And obviously the one that we just mentioned earlier about the test drives, we'll be sharing the links on our newsletter that will be coming out on Easter Monday. Do check out the links for more details on these stories. But we're sticking with car dealer, and the story is also ran in depth on AM Online, but this is about Peter Vardy. That Peter Vardy opens former Cazoo handover site as a used car dealership. So obviously, I mean, that's a handover site now transferring to a retail outlet. And this is on the back that a while ago we talked about Peter Vardy in discussions to buy two of the ex-Cazoo operations. But actually, this is saying that they've bought one. That deal is going ahead. But the other one that was in Livingston that was a prep centre is not gone through. So they have acquired the Cazoo site in Grangemouth, and they are about to spend $1 million on refitting it as a retail outlet for the Peter Vardy cars operation up there. So yeah, great opportunity there for Peter Vardy.
Yeah, and it's actually up and running because Peter Vardy was on LinkedIn during the week saying how well the first month had gone, and it's a really interesting story. This, and I guess what appealed to me because it's was that this site was actually an Imperial Car Supermarket site that was bought by Cazoo. And it was made into a handover centre, but now it's gone back. It's reverted back to being a supermarket. There's room for 100 used cars on site, and it's certainly resonating. It's early days, but it seems to be resonating with that local audience in Grangemouth because they have been busy. So it was a good call, and it just shows that the population needed a supermarket where they could actually go and look at cars before buying them. Because I guess the irony of this story, well, one of the ironies of this story is that Cars, the Peter Vardy multi-franchise used car operation, actually operates on a similar concept to Cazoo in that you can pick and choose the cars online. But the main difference is that you can actually go to the showroom, look at the car and test drive it. We were talking about test drives earlier,
Yes.
which you couldn't do when it was a handover centre. That would be the first time that you saw the vehicle.
No, and it's a great point. I mean, this is key, and you referenced there that it used to be an Imperial business before the acquisition of Cazoo. So I suppose in terms of the area, they're used to that there was a supermarket there with
Yeah.
Imperial, and Imperial was a successful business, and I suppose it's now back in there as a car supermarket, and I'm sure that it probably didn't, as you say. I mean, we talked about spending $1 million on it, but I suppose reverting it back to what Imperial had before under the Peter Vardy brand was probably a very quick and swift move for them.
Yeah, and initially when we heard about this story, because it was a few months ago that we first reported on Peter Vardy looking at acquiring some Cazoo businesses. So Grangemouth went ahead and was reopened, but at the time they were also looking at the Livingston Prep Centre, which apparently hasn't gone through. So Peter Vardy just concentrating on Grangemouth there.
And just sticking quickly with Peter Vardy, because I know Peter does listen to the podcast, but they've now expanded as an element of their business, because they own Car Money, which is a motor finance broker service, and they've launched over in Perth, Western Australia there. So great opportunity there, and I suppose there's many synergies between the UK market and Australia. There's obviously other than the distance
Yes.
over in Australia and the time delay over there, as I well know, speaking to a lot of my colleagues over in Australia. But this, it's a great, shows the growth and vision of Peter Vardy there. That they've obviously taken that business, and on the 100th anniversary of the business as well, that they've gone for a Car Money expansion over in Australia. So congratulations to the Peter Vardy team for doing that, and I suspect that that won't be the last of, probably, if it works over in Australia, then why can't it work in other international markets as well?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It will be scalable. I'm sure they are looking at other markets, and listeners will be interested to hear that Stuart McKay, who was formerly at Peter Vardy, has rejoined the business as chief executive of Car Money Oceania, and he's now busy putting together a team to go with this launch. So it's going to be an interesting one to watch.
Definitely. But that's it for this week. So again, happy Easter. Those that are off and celebrating it, don't eat too many chocolate eggs. Hopefully the weather holds out, and those that are working, hopefully not on Easter Sunday. But if you are small enough, I suspect you will be. But I hope you have a busy weekend, and the weather does pull a few people out into the car showrooms and online as well. So wish you all the best for that.
That's all for now. Many thanks for joining us on the Motor Trade Radio podcast. As Phil says, do enjoy your Easter weekend if you're working or if you've got time off. So until next week, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from him.
You've been listening to Motor Trade Radio Podcast, powered by eBay Motors Group. We'll be sharing all the links from this week's headlines on Monday morning. So to make sure you receive them, just subscribe to the free newsletter on our LinkedIn page. Just search Motor Trade Radio Podcast.